Hi, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining our Lattes and Learning webinar this morning. I'm Amy McCoy. I'm the marketing manager over here at Ongoing Operations, and we have another great co-hosted webinar this morning with our friends over at Messick Lauer and Smith. So as always, for those of you who have attended some of our webinars or are new to this one, feel free to ask any questions throughout the presentation by typing those questions into the questions section, and we'll go ahead and either try to answer them as we're going along, or we can also do them at the end when we have an open question and answer session for everyone. So feel free to either enter them throughout the presentation or save them to the end. Both work. And also a copy of the slides, if you're interested in having those at the end, is in the handout section of this presentation. So you can go ahead and download those if you wish. A recording of the webinar will also be emailed out upon completion. So with that, I'll go ahead and just introduce quickly the ongoing operations team here that's going to be on the call. We have Jonathan Derby, who's our CIO, and Shane Butcher, who's our Senior Solutions and Security Architect and Virtual CISO. And we have the legal team of Messick Lauer and Smith here. We have Jen Winston and Mike Heller, who are associates. And with that, I will kick it over to Mike to start our webinar on email retention policies for credit unions.
All right, great. So thank you, Amy. So as Amy mentioned, today we will be discussing legal requirements and best practices for email retention policies. First and foremost, let's start with what regulators have to say in this area. Unfortunately, not much. Financial regulators do not regulate email retention directly, but they do speak to minimum retention times for specific documents. So without any sort of specific requirements for email retention, we're going to be revisiting legal requirements and guidance for record retention generally and apply those standards to emails specifically. So bear with me for a bit here. We're going to be returning to emails specifically, I promise. But first, we'll talk specifically about email retention requirements from a regulatory standpoint. So next slide, please. Okay, so before we kind of go into the NCUA regulations, I just wanted to briefly mention that today we're going to be discussing legal requirements for the financial industry. There's other record retention requirements for other industries that are likely applicable to your organization, notably like employee health records, HR records. But given the time today, we're just going to be focusing specifically on financial industry legal requirements. If you have any other questions for other retention requirements outside of what's discussed during the presentation today, feel free to reach out to any one of us after the presentation. So, looking specifically here at the NCUA regulations, it's important to note that the NCUA does not regulate record retention policies and procedures. It does, however, provide requirements for preserving vital records. So NCUA regulations parts 748 and 749 implement Gramm-Leach-Bliley standards to protect member information and records. Part 749, as we see on this slide, requires credit unions to develop and maintain a vital records preservation program. There are also certain official and operational records that Part 749 requires that your credit union retains permanently, like your charter, bylaws, board minutes, and lists of destroyed records. For every other record that is not deemed vital under the regulation, NCUA recommends periodic destruction unless some other federal or state law requires a minimum retention period. So having said that, I'll now turn over to Jen Winston to discuss some of the legally required minimum retention times and the impact that litigation holds have on your retention and your disposal procedures.
Good morning, everyone. I wanted to quickly touch on the different regulations that consumer protection regulations that have retention guidelines. So we could switch to the next slide. So as Mike was saying, there is no overarching, but certain consumer protection regs require certain retention periods. Regulation Z, you can find this, I put the section numbers next to each regulation so you can find the provisions that discuss it, but they have a general 2-year requirement They do have some others. So there's 3 years for your loan originator compensation and your ability to repay qualified mortgage rule documents. For your loans that are subject to TRID, you must retain evidence of compliance with TRID for 3 years. And then all of your closing disclosures you need to hold for 5 years. So if you did any of this by email, if you retained any of it electronically, you need to follow these same rules as you would if it was a paper document. Regulation B has a general 25-month requirement. I wanted to specifically point out these pre-screened solicitations. If you do this and you get any sort of correspondence, including informal or even an informal complaint about this via email, you need to retain that as well. All of that is something you should be keeping under Reg B. Your Bank Secrecy Act, AML, that examination manual has an appendix on record retention requirements. There, it varies. It can be 5 years for some, shorter for others. But a best practice in the industry is retain everything for 5 years so that you're not trying to remember what has a different retention period. 5 years is the max. Keep it for 5. You're good. Regulation E. That's generally 2 years from the time of providing the disclosures for your electronic funds transfers. Truth in savings is also 2 years from providing the disclosures. Regulation X, the mortgage servicing under RESPA is going to be 1 year and that is after the date the mortgage is either discharged or your servicing is transferred to another servicer. Regulation C, on the next slide, that is 3 years for your modified register that's available to the public, and the disclosure statement is 5 years. Again, if you have anything discussing this that's saved in your email, retain it for the same period you would these paper copies. Regulation CC, your funds availability, that's going to be 2 years at least. That's a minimum. Fair Credit Reporting Act, that is 3 years for your pre-screened offers. And then Regulation B, which is the implementing regulations for FCRA, they require that you maintain your records for a reasonable period of time, which is no less than any other applicable reporting requirement. So depending on what that document is, you'll want to save it for a reasonable period of time. Flood insurance, if you have any sort of notices that you're sending, it needs to be for the life of the loan or for as long as the credit union is owning the loan. And then just something to consider, your employment tax records should be 4 years. So again, anything in your email about that, keep it for at least 4 years. And then I just wanted to briefly touch on states can also impose their own retention requirements. So when you're setting your minimum requirements, you'll want to look to make sure that your state that you are in doesn't have a minimum requirement that is more strict than these federal requirements. If the state requirement is a longer period, that's what you should be following, not the federal. So just make sure that your local council is reviewing that period, just to make sure that you are good with your state law as well. So those are your basic consumer protection regs. So then I also wanted to talk about litigation holds. When you have any sort of pending, threatened, or even reasonably anticipated litigation coming your way, you need to keep and retain anything that you have that could apply to that potential situation. So throw out your automatic and routine disruption policy. Don't worry if your record retention says, oh, it's 25 months, we're at 26 months. No, if you have any reason to believe that litigation will be coming down the pike on this particular case, you need to save it until that litigation is over. Generally, you find out about this obligation either if you get a lawsuit or a subpoena, if you get a letter from an agency, and then oftentimes you'll just get a demand letter or some sort of other letter from an attorney that says, hey, this is our problem, you have 30 days to fix it, or we're going to file suit. Once you're on notice from something like that, you need to make sure that if you do have some sort of automated routine data destruction policy, you're able to pull this out and hold on to it. That is your obligation, is to preserve all your electronic and your hard copies for this. And it's fine if it's 27 months and you get a notice on something that you deleted at 25 months, it's also perfectly fine to respond to requests for information that we have deleted this through in accordance with our data destruction policy at its designated date. That's fine. You're never going to get in trouble for deleting something according to your policy. But if you haven't done it yet and then you're on notice, you must retain that information. I think that's all I have, so I'm going to kick it back to Mike to continue on with some more best practices.
All right, great. Thanks, Jen. So as we've seen, certain documents require minimum retention times. So it's essential that you have the ability to categorize records by type. You should also, with the assistance of legal counsel, like Jen mentioned there, create a record retention schedule that incorporates these legally required retention times. So finally, you should draft, or if you already have a policy, review it and update it for your record retention, record preservation, and record disposal procedures to ensure that, one, that vital records are retained and protected, that they're preserved in order to properly store, identify, and ultimately reconstruct the record in the event it is destroyed. And finally, if the record is no longer required to be retained, to ensure that it's disposed of appropriately. So for the next few slides, I will go into a little bit more detail here on some of these points and include some best practices. So looking specifically at categorizing the record types, it's best to consult with department heads, legal, IT, and HR at your organization when categorizing the records to best understand where your records are, how long they need to be retained, and to develop or update procedures to incorporate into your policies. I think it's best to have broad categories for simplicity and also to create more manageable retention, preservation, and disposal processes. The records within each category should be assigned their minimum retention times and incorporated into a centralized record retention schedule. And these categories should be reviewed periodically to ensure compliance with the applicable laws and best practices and updated accordingly. So if we move to the next slide, we talk specifically about your policy. It should include all the relevant players and describe what their responsibilities should be to comply with your policy. So this includes executive and senior management, program administrator, your department heads, IT, as well as your employees. The policy should also be a guide for management and employees and include your record retention, preservation, and disposal procedures. And I'll be going into some further detail on those specifically as we move forward. As Jen mentioned, your policy should detail your processes and procedures in the event that litigation is pending, threatened, or anticipated against your credit union or your employees to make sure that all relevant records to the litigation are properly retained and preserved. And then also to make sure that any such relevant records aren't disposed of. So finally, your policy should be audited and reviewed on at least an annual basis and updated accordingly on what the audit and the review finds. And one final note too about your policy, it should align and support with your organization's business strategy, your organizational culture, your technical capabilities, as well as your compliance requirements. So looking specifically at record retention procedures, your organization should be identifying and classifying each record in accordance with your retention schedule. You should have a list where your records are stored. Records should be retained at least within the minimum retention prior to disposal. For records that do not have required minimum retention times that don't fall within a particular retention category, they should be retained in a discretionary manner. So going back to NCUA Regulation 749, the NCUA recommends that all non-vital records should be disposed of after both your annual audit and a supervisory examination is completed by the NCUA or any other applicable supervising agency. So if you have any questions about the nature of any particular record, whether or not it falls within, does it have this required retention period or does it not, you should always consult with the policy's program administrator and legal counsel. So for all records, regardless of required retention times, there's pros and cons to retaining records past their required retention periods. So most notably, for strictly enforced shorter retention and disposal procedures, they may be burdensome on your staff and risk non-compliance with your policy if they're not timely followed. And, looking from like a longer retention, if you retain documents longer and, don't dispose of them on a timely basis, it increases risk that a security vulnerability or an unauthorized user could expose sensitive information. And kind of what Jen was saying as well, it also increases legal risk if you're asked to produce relevant documents through discovery. Because if you still have those documents, you will have to supply them since they've been requested. And then, as Jen mentioned, if you do dispose of them in accordance with your policy, you're in line with your practices and procedures there. So, you should assess the risks to your organization and consult with your board and legal counsel, to see what best applies to your organization before moving forward in any manner. So going on specifically for record preservation, you should be maintaining a log that shows what records have been preserved, where they're preserved, when they were preserved, and the person who's responsible for their preservation. These duplicate records should be preserved off-site in a separate data processing system than the one located at your credit union. And your record retention, your record preservation policy and procedures should be in accordance with, and it may be incorporated into your business continuity and disaster recovery program. So if you go to the next slide, for record disposal, you need to maintain a permanent list of disposed records, like I mentioned previously. So the list should include a description of the disposed records, which should match the description of the record as categorized in your record retention schedule. The list should also include the date the record was initially retained and then the date it was ultimately disposed of. So long as there's no litigation hold and so long as the record has been retained and preserved for its required retention period and properly documented, the record may then be destroyed. Okay, so moving on to the next slide, what does this all mean for email? Right, so record retention, preservation, and disposal procedures apply to information restored or received and stored electronically to the same extent that information is to the same extent required for information that's not received electronically. So the legal requirements and best practices we've discussed up until this point apply equally to your emails. So it's important to categorize email like you would any other document. If the content of the email falls within one of the retention categories in your record retention schedule, it should be retained for the period associated with that type of document. So for instance, an email regarding TRIG compliance should be retained for the amount of time required under Reg Z. So similarly, for emails that do not fall within a specific retention category, it's best practice to retain until after both your annual audit and supervisory exam. And for all non-vital emails in particular, you can archive, after a certain period of time, usually within 90 days or so. And then, it's recommended best practice to delete after a year. So that concludes my portion of the presentation. And I will now pass the mic over to Shane, who will be discussing some technical considerations for your email retention procedures.
Thank you, Mike and Jen. Appreciate that. So when we look at technical considerations, what we first have to look at, does your technology support the policies? And looking back at everything, both Jen and Mike, covered, looking specifically at email, can we retain the documents, that were required to by policy? Are we able to destroy them within that policy? And if we have different retention policies or, and retention times around those documents, are we able to support that? And does our technology allow us to classify the various types of documents, within our systems? And then, once we know if the technology supports that, these policies, are we actually following the policies? Have we configured the systems that way? And, are they actually in operation? Are staff able to complete that? So as we continue to look at the technical, considerations, for retaining email, are we journaling email to third parties? A number of credit unions offsite journal, loan originator documents to ensure compliance for their regulating entities. Are we doing that, and are they, following the policies? Do we have archiving enabled, both either to local, machines or within our email environments or Office, 365? Have we enabled a retention in our email systems? Exchange and Office 365 are by far the most common ones we see, and both allow retention of documents and emails as well as destruction. But have we configured those policies to make sure that things are retained? And then we have to look at, our employees using local PST files to save their documents out to. That poses a problem with both knowing what we have, ensuring retention. Although if we've got retention policies, that's less of a problem. But it really becomes a problem when we're looking at the destruction. If it's decentralized storage, now we're not able to do that, and so we need to look at what our policies allow us to do, both from a destruction and then a discovery point of view, trying to produce those documents from a local file during a discovery, creates a greater burden on our credit unions. Then we also need to look at the purging of the email. So if we are going to just if we do have policies around destroying email after those time periods, we have to look, are they timed? Just, are we destroying emails under certain conditions after 90 days or a year or 5 years, or are we doing a retention period around these and then actually automatically purging, or just not forcing the retention anymore? There's a couple ways that we can look at that, and they'll have to go within your policies and within your your organization and rules to make sure that we're complying with those, but there are technical abilities to do that. And so as we look at this, I believe Mike brought that up, classification is critical, right? We don't know how to treat that document if we don't know what it is. And different ways that we can automatically classify within our our email systems. One is based on the user or group that originates it. I mentioned before, folks using various journaling technologies for loan origination documents, right? If we know that a particular group, we have to retain their communications for a period of time, we can classify documents in our email systems based on that. Looking for keywords in the documents, right? Especially if our systems generate certain text and we know that those are going to be part of a retention program, right? We can look for those and we can classify those documents and retain them based on those keyword searches, right? And then also for sensitive data, we need to, there may be times where we have to ensure we retain things and know that with this particular type of sensitive data, it falls under those classification categories. So that's another way that we can use our systems to help us classify that data, to ensure that our automatic processes, both for retention and deletion, are working as expected. So if we look at, what can we do now, right, to make sure that we are keeping our credit unions in a secure posture and moving this forward, the first thing we need to do is review our policies, as Mike mentioned, right? What are you required to retain and for how long? And, if may want to get with local counsel to ensure that your record preservation policy, matches both state and federal laws. But let's review those policies and make sure that they're up to date and reflect what we're required to do. Are we required to destroy anything by our policies? And if so, are we, doing that? And then, lastly, when we review our policies, what does our data classification policy say, and are we classifying that data, right? Let's make sure that our policies, match what we're doing. And so then we want to review our email configuration. If we're just, looking back here at email retention, do we have retention policies set, that targets the actual data that we need to retain? Are you journaling to a third party for certain types of emails, or even all emails, and are those retention policies set correctly and being maintained? And do you have a deletion policy? For anything that's not required to be retained, are we deleting it after a year, 13 months, after our audits, to ensure that that we're maintaining our policies? And then lastly, are your employees following your policies? Have they created PST files so that they have their own archive? Are they classifying data correctly if we're requiring them to do that manually? Have we communicated those policies out to our employees so that we know what we're requiring of them as far as this, as far as our email retention programs go? And I just wanted to check, Jonathan, was there anything you wanted to add before we go to questions?
Nope, I think you covered it all.
Okay, all right. So now we're on to questions, and I'm going to hand it back over to Amy for questions.
Yeah, so as if anyone has any questions on anything that went over or anything maybe we didn't touch on that you're curious to know, please go ahead and type those in, and we can relay those out to the team. We did have one come in earlier that I believe is for Mike. So you suggested that the doc retention policy should be audited at least annually. Do you have a best practice time period that you recommend, or is annually sufficient?
So I think that annually is sufficient. Now, the only time that you would be required to, well, not necessarily even required, but the only time I would recommend reviewing it more than an annual basis is if there's some sort of change in applicable laws. Like for instance, with all these privacy regulations that have been passed recently on a state basis, if something like that is moving along to signing into legislation, you might want to do a quick refresher of your policy to make sure that it still aligns with new legal requirements. But that's the only instance I think I would recommend reviewing more than on an annual basis.
Okay, great. Thank you. We also had another question come in that was on the record preservation log. Can you please go through what exactly, what type of information has to actually be included in that log?
Yeah, sure. So again, like the big thing is that the information is actually stored somewhere. So for the log information, you can literally just include who's actually, so typically it'll be like whoever is preserving the information. So you need to identify who's actually handling that record, where it's actually being preserved, including like an address, and then also a description of the record that is being preserved. So the description should match up how that particular record is mentioned in your record retention schedule. So that way, for ease of kind of identifying it, it's like, oh, okay, this matches with how we categorize it in the schedule. And and then outside of that, after the description, the date that it's ultimately preserved, and again, who ultimately sends it.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Mike. So those were the questions that came in. Does anyone have any other questions that they'd like to ask the team? Please go ahead and type those in. And also, I will just note again that if you would like a copy of these slides of what we went through today, please go ahead. They're in the handout section, so you can go ahead and download those. And we'll also send a recording of the webinar out in a follow-up email tomorrow. So and if you have any other questions that come up after this, of course, we've got it on the screen here, contact information for the folks at Messick Lauer Smith, as well as the ongoing operations team. And you can go ahead and email over any follow-up questions you may have. So I'm not seeing any more questions coming in. So I don't know if any of you guys want to give any concluding thoughts before we end our webinar. We can go ahead and do that.
Nope, just like to thank everybody for joining, and I appreciate it.
I would just echo what Shane said there. Thanks everybody for attending. Look forward to having any questions you guys might have.
Yeah, thanks, guys. So have a good rest of your day.
Thanks, everybody.